spending millions to do that. The point I wanted to raise by bringing this to the attention of the viewers once again is to indicate how this undermines the credibility of the PNM administration in Tobago to have us believe that they are interested in accountability in Tobago, when in fact in Trinidad they are operating clearly outside the realms of accountability. The Office of the Auditor General is an independent office, and it is a spectacle. It continues to be a spectacle because we are not sure whether or not the Auditor General would let the matter rest. And I am doubting that the matter would rest, and therefore we will spend a lot more on a matter that should not have gone before the Auditor General. It raises the issue about accountability and whether or not we can bring public officials in Trinidad and Tobago to account. I would want the audience to recall our Chief Secretary saying that he provides resources to the police because they don't have the resources, against the advice of the Auditor General, justifying it by saying that it is needed, it is necessary for crime prevention. Notwithstanding, it is breaching the rules of the Financial and Exchequer Act to be paying for services that the THA, that's not under the 5th schedule and cannot be properly paid for by the THA. I want to go back to the whole issue of accountability. I heard the minority leader, telling the public servants in Tobago that they have to be strong and that they have to stick to the rules and regulations. But here we have the Minister of Finance doing quite the opposite. And clearly, there is no moral authority in the Tobago space for the PNM administration to claim that they are interested in accountability when it's not taking place in Trinidad, and they are not saying anything about it as it happens in Trinidad. So I think it's hypocritical, and we need to point out these things because accountability has to be across the board. And I'm saying that it's not happening in Tobago, it's not happening in Trinidad, and as a country, we have to bring accountability on the front burner if in fact we are going to move our country from a third world space into a third world space, into a first world space. At this point, I want to go to the clip of Dr. Faith P. Israel, or Dr. Faith Sandy, as I would like to call her at this point, as she would have referred to herself, because there are a number of issues that arise from the statements she would have made at the last plenary that we must examine and we must comment on. First, I want to, while you bring up the clip, first I want to address the issue of a clear breach of protocol. In my understanding of the organizational structure of the THA, a secretary ought not to be interacting directly with staff unless there is an administrator present. The administrator ought to be responsible for administrative issues, including staff, and if there is a discussion between the secretary and staff, the administrator should be present. The conduct of the secretary, by her own admission, which we will come to shortly, demonstrates quite clearly that it was being very disrespectful, I think, not only to the workers, but an affront to our democratic traditions in Tobago and in Trinidad and Tobago. For a secretary to use the kind of language that Dr. Faith B. Sandy used to the employees at Public Health. And I want to underscore that Dr. Faith B. Sandy is also the Secretary for Social Protection. Producer, you could play the clip.
Of Assembly, where we are going to spend $7, $8, probably $9 million. I took it upon myself to go and speak to the employees there to let them know we're coming to the end of signing the contract. We are going to get the work started just now. Don't be surprised when you see mobilization happening up here. Because it may also affect how they work. Because, you now have a construction site connected to a workplace, and we have to look at the OSH expectations and so forth. And I said to them, this is me and AMPLIA talking. We are going to have an honest conversation. Now remember I said that half of me is a Sandy from Goat Rock. And we had an honest conversation, Madam Presiding Officer. Now, part of that conversation included something that my colleague spoke about. Because one of the men who were there, who is a driver of a vehicle, came in slippers. And I said to him, he actually came in slippers. I actually think he probably had on his shoes, and because you see me, he put on the slippers to make a point. Because he does not have the appropriate boots. So we actually had a full conversation about that, Madam Presiding Officer. Why don't you have the boots? And we went all the way around. We actually did a deep dive, a root cause analysis kind of conversation about why he does not have the boots. And you know what it is? The new procurement laws says that even if the OSH officer thinks that this specific brand of boots is the best brand because it has these requirements, the foreman or the senior officer can't put the name of the brand. They have to describe the boot and hope that when procurement goes out, procurement gets that specific brand of that specific boot because that is what is needed. And somehow that conversation did not really happen, so that when the foreman said we need boots, and procurement went out and buy boots, the boots that came were the wrong boots. Now, we spent the money, which means that for us to have to buy boots for him again, we have to get the money. And yes, I did say I have to pull it out of me. Because we have to find the money again after we went through the process to get the boots. Because we buy it already, Madam Presiding Officer. And all of this leads to productivity again, because you know why? That same morning, 7 o'clock that morning, I was on the phone talking to somebody. Because the workers couldn't get to them.
Now, I am almost sure that after listening to that clip, you will not believe that this is the conduct of our Deputy Chief Secretary, the Secretary responsible for social protection, the Secretary that is responsible for gender affairs, and to make sure that people are not abused and so on. And this is the conduct of our Deputy Chief Secretary, our Secretary for Health and Social Protection. And it's not so much that the conduct or the action took place, but the temerity of the secretary to come into the house and to explain to us the kind of language that she used and to justify it. Now, we have had exposure to many politicians in Tobago. Politicians who have done extremely well for Tobago. And they have not had to descend to the kind of language, the kind of conduct that was just exhibited by Dr. Faith Sandy. And I'm saying, Tobagonians, while I was on campus studying, there was a very interesting character, a guy called Joseph George. His name was Livingston George. A Vincentian chap, very tall, very strapping, and he said a number of interesting things to me. And one of those things was that he said, so he used to call me Mr. Barry. So he said, if Mr. Barry, if someone puts their finger in front of your eye and you don't blink, they will put it on your eyeball. And if you don't blink, they will take your eyes out. The moral of that story and what he was trying to say to me at the time is that we have to know where to stop, especially in this case, politicians from abusing us. And I'm saying, Tobago, we need to look at this action and we need to address it in a very serious way and manner. And, I am calling on the minority leader. I'm calling on Mr. Watson Duke, who are present in the House, to really address this matter of the abuse of workers by our Deputy Chief Secretary, so that we don't have a repeat of this kind of conduct taking place in what we call this August chamber, a chamber where we are supposed to be discussing, or they were discussing, this issue of productivity. And one of the issues that create a less than productive workforce is the issue of micromanagement. If you read the literature, and it's very clear to me, as I would have brought to your attention, I think it was on the last occasion where the Assistant Secretary with responsibility for sport said he was going about cleaning toilets. Now we have the spectacle of the Deputy Chief Secretary saying that she is going to talk to workers about boots and who have boots and who didn't have boots, and there was part of it about scaffolding and so on. Secretaries are responsible for policy, not for administrative matters. Those are matters that are for the administrator of this division. And I want to ask the question, where was the administrator of this division when the workers were being spoken to like this by the secretary? Who was defending these workers when the secretary asked the questions that she asked? And I'm wondering why she didn't say the same thing in the House. Now listen, we have to get serious in Tobago, and we have to have a certain level of decorum that is expected. And I don't think even after that plenary sitting that the Deputy Chief Secretary understands what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. And I think we need to, as a population here in Tobago, if we are serious, bring it squarely to our attention so that this doesn't repeat itself. There are fewer issues I wanted to raise coming out of that interview. And it's the lack of understanding of monitoring and evaluation. You don't have a strategic plan for the division. What are you monitoring or evaluating? For you to monitor and evaluate, you ought to have some benchmark, some objective, some goal, and your monitoring officer will know ask the appropriate questions, monitor to see whether you are on track, or you are off track, and they would provide a report saying what you need to do in order to return to the track that you're supposed to be on. That's what a monitoring evaluation officer would do. But if you do not have a benchmark, you do not have objectives, and by the way, the Millennium Development Goals are very broad goals, and those cannot be at all the goals that are utilized to monitor what goes on in the health department of the THA or under social protection or under any of the divisions at all, because the goals are so broad. And if that is the goals that are being used, then surely we're not going to achieve anything at all. And the final comment I would like to make about this clear and blatant disregard for workers is the whole issue of strategic planning. And yes, the Secretary was correct that there were a number of plans. There was the CDP document that was done. And if in fact time was taken, because I happen to have read the CDP document, if time was taken, they would have recognized there was a recommendation under the CDP document for a Tobago Productivity Council. In the plenary, they were talking about Barbados and the Productivity Council that they exist in Barbados. But there was also a recommendation under the CDP document, or in the CDP document that was done by Dr. Ralph Henry, about a Tobago Productivity Council. We heard no such recommendation coming from the Secretary, the Assistant Secretary for Sport, who carried the motion to indicate any such requirement for a productivity council in Tobago. And yes, you are right, the plan was there, they didn't utilize it, and they spent a lot of money for the plan, I'm assuming. However, you have the opportunity to use the very plan, use the very ideas in the plan, inclusive of the Tobago Productivity Council, that would help to address the very issue of productivity that you are trying to address in the House, rather than descending into the kind of language that would have been uttered in the House. And furthermore, such language does not and will not improve productivity. In fact, it will do the opposite, because I'm sure the workers are not incentivized by that kind of language, and I'm sure the productivity will decline as a result of the kind of comments that have been made. So, listen, Tobago, we need to be serious about the conduct that we accept and allow in the hallowed halls of the THA from our secretaries, our assistant secretaries, and across the board, the minority as well, such that we go there to discuss issues, to discuss policy that would allow us to address the issue. So what we had was an entire session devoted to addressing an issue of productivity, from which there was no conclusion, for which you had no recommendations for addressing the problem. So the problem still exists without any suggestion of a recommendation, but an entire sitting was conducted, and the time of all these secretaries spent at that meeting to come to no conclusion, no suggestion, no recommendation about what we must do about productivity in the Tobago space. And therefore, the issue of low productivity remains. Producer, I think we can take a break here and come back to the second aspect of, or the third aspect of this session, where we look at the steel pan industry and what we can do about having Tobago manufacture pans, manufacture drums, export steel pans, import pans for retuning, and re-export from right here in Tobago.
The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the commentators, guest, and the host. They do not explicitly or necessarily reflect nor represent the policy or views held by Tobago Updates or this network. Tobago Updates or this network cannot be held accountable for all or any views expressed during this program.
Welcome back, viewers. And at this stage in this program, we will look at the steel pan industry. Many years ago, while I was in another space, there was a foresighting project that was done, a national foresighting project that attempted to identify products, commodities from Trinidad and Tobago that had the capacity to be exported and generate foreign exchange. I can recall cocoa being one of them and steel pan being another. And since then, the steel pan would have come to my attention in many ways as an instrument that can be monetized to earn this country a significant amount of foreign exchange. A simple analogy would be the highest a barrel of oil might get on the world market would probably be 100 and probably just over 100 US dollars a barrel. You take that same oil drum after the oil has been poured out of it, and you cut it, and you can sell the same oil drum as a steel pan for 1,000 US dollars. Now, just on the face of it, without looking at the size of the market for oil and the size of the market for pan, it stands to reason that the steel pan has a lot of potential in terms of its marketability, in terms of its ability to earn foreign exchange and revenue for this country called Trinidad and Tobago. Why has it not happened? I think Tobago has been in existence maybe since independence, and we have somebody on the line in the person of Mr. Byron Serret, who was a past director of Tobago, and he will introduce himself to us so that we have a better understanding of his expertise to speak to this matter of the steel pan, while I will ask him a few questions to probe about why the industry has gone, in my mind, nowhere. Yet every year we hear about a good panorama, but where is pan going? I don't know how much the steel pan players are paid for 3 months of activity. The last I think I heard is probably $1,000, so maybe $500 a month for how many hours of playing steel pan. This cannot be the way we reward steel pan players for their effort in promoting this national instrument. Something has to be done. And hopefully to explain to us why this industry has gone, in my mind, nowhere, is Mr. Byron Serrett. Mr. Byron Serrett, you could take the opportunity to introduce yourselves to the listeners of this program so that they will understand that you are quite competent to address this matter before we proceed along the lines of my questioning.
Okay, good night, Barry. Good night to all your listeners. My last official position in Steelban was Vice President of Tobago and Events Manager, from which I resigned with effect from the 1st of November 2016. However, my life in Steelban began when I was about 13 years old with a band from my community, Diego Martin. And then I was, in 1968, one Ray Holman came to teach in Fatima College, where I was a student. And I followed him into Starliff for a few years. So I played with Starliff during the period 69 to 71. In 71, I returned to my community and restarted a band called Meritones. And I was one of the main ingredients in Meritones, coming from second to last in their first Panorama in 1972 to fifth in Panorama. Them days they didn't have small, medium, and large. Fifth in the Panorama of 1990, which is the famous Panorama when Pan by Storm came second. Between that time, I would have held positions on the northern region of Tobago. I would have held positions in many committees within Tobago. I acted as the education officer for a period, and back in those days, I became the secretary and then the chairman of the region and the executive of Tobago. The way it was constituted at the time, there was a national executive, so that the secretary and chairman of each region was part of that national executive. And so I served from Arnim Smith to Owen Serrett to Patrick Arnold, and I came in 2009 with the Kidia's administration as the vice president, and I served for 7 years. I was the events manager, and I was responsible for a lot of changes that has taken place in Panorama from even since the Owen Serrett days and Patrick Arnold, because I would have advised and influenced some of the changes. I can speak without fear of contradiction that of two particular things that people talk about these days, but they don't know when it came into being. One is the time that Panorama ends. Now if Panorama goes after midnight, everybody is up in arms, but people forget Panorama used to finish at 4, 4:30 in the morning. And I was responsible for bringing it down to finishing closer to midnight. I did a time study, analyzed it, and came back the following year. I think it would have been 1994, 95, Owen Serrett was the president. And if you check back the history, you would find that on that night, those days they had 12 bands in the final. As I said, there was no small, medium, and large. It was one Panorama. Exodus was band number 12. And at 12:15, Exodus was rolling on stage, which was unheard of prior to that. Prior to that, Panorama would finish at 12. So much so that Alison Henderson and they, doing the TV commentary, wondered aloud, what are they going to do with the time? They come here to be here till 12, till 4, And there it is, 12:30, and the panorama is done. So that's one. Another thing that I can speak about without fear of contradiction is the question of stipend for the players. Hardly anyone knows that I was the first person to introduce that idea to Owen Serrett. I did a questionnaire to Barnes, and then when Patrick Arnold came in, I also put it towards him, and he is the one who instituted it. That started with me, and I can give everything that led up to it and why it is paid, how it is paid. So those are just giving that as information. I have always been somebody who would think different from most people in terms of steel band matters, and I will share some of that with you all tonight.
All right. So I'm happy. I think the audience would be clear now that you have excellent knowledge of the steel pan industry. So I'm sure you will be able to answer some of the questions which you might have been alluding to without understanding or without knowing. You mentioned the Kit Diaz regime, that you would have been part of that regime.
Yep.
My research shows that Ernst & Young did some auditing for 3 years under Pantrin-Bago under that regime, a regime which you indicated you were part of. And what came out of it was a scandalous state of affairs of Pantrin-Bago. I don't know whether or not those affairs have changed because, and I want you to answer this question in terms of an accountability session, because for me, I would think after every carnival or after every panorama season, maybe 3 months after, we should have an accountability session for income expenditure, because I am sure you would have read the report that Ernst & Young produced, and that report says...
Look at here.
Okay, and that report says so many scary things about the conduct of Pantrin-Bago with respect to its management of the steel pan industry. So, can you explain, I mean, how did we get to that, and how do we ensure that that does not repeat itself?
Okay. Firstly, Pantrin-Bago is not responsible for the steel band industry. That's the first thing. So let's separate the sheep from the goat here. Pantrin-Bago is an organization of bands charged with the responsibility of seeking the best for steel bands in whatever environment that they find themselves. Many years ago, and is one of the things I have railed against, is that NCC became the vehicle through which Pantrin-Bago must pass, let's say. And I have said, and I have it there somewhere in one of my notes, if you read the Act 9, if you read Act 9 of 91, which is the NCC Act, the NCC Act speaks about carnival. Pantrin-Bago is not about carnival. Pantrin-Bago is about pan. So how does the NCC, and it is in the audit of EY that the NCC has they erroneously state that the NCC has jurisdiction over Pantrin-Bago for non-carnival events. That is not so. That is not so. In terms of the report, the Ernst & Young report, let me say this from the outset. There were many things in Pantrin-Bago and with relation to Kit Diaz that I, because of my background, was not happy and comfortable with, and within the executive, I would be making certain objections. And it came to a point, and those people who were closer to Pantrin-Bago would know, it came to a point where for probably more than a year, myself and Diaz was not even on proper speaking terms. Because of the way he conducted himself, because of the way he attempted to conduct the business of Pan Tobago, of which I objected strenuously. So that it came to a head in 2016. In 2016, in August of 2016, I got information of a transaction that was done by Diaz as president of Pan Tobago that had never come to the Central Executive, of a transaction that took place in January, February, and March, and then again in June of that year. And I got the information in August.
Well, not continue, of course, Mr. Seret. Not continue, of course, but
Yes.
so don't you have like monthly meetings of the executive where you discuss matters of expenditure and so on?
I will repeat. Yes, we do, but I will repeat. I've got this information of things that were done that never came before the executive.
Okay. Proceed.
Right? It isn't that we didn't used to meet, we would meet everyone. The Constitution demands that we meet everyone. But if certain things take place and they are not brought before the executive, I have no knowledge.
So that is still possible.
I got wind. Huh?
Is that still possible?
Well, that depends on the will of the persons involved, you know.
Okay.
Because a person could decide that they're not going to bring something, and let's say, as happened in this particular instance, the president would know that he is doing something, and another member of the executive, another member enabled him to do it, but neither of them spoke about it in an executive meeting. But when I got wind of it, and I questioned, and I got the information, and then I went further because of links that I had, I was able to investigate the matter much deeper than a normal man could. And I got a whole lot of information. And based on that information, on the 23rd of September, I think it was a Friday, I had a meeting with the then Minister of Culture, the now Minister of Education, Ms. Gatsby Dolly, and her secretary, and not her permanent secretary. And I indicated to them that I was going to resign from Pan Tobago, and I gave them the reasons why. I gave them the written information as to why. They asked me certain pertinent questions for which I gave them the answers. And I dare say that is the basis on which the Ernst & Young report was eventually, right? So a lot of people believe that, including the present president, and I had to make a statement that she didn't know, a lot of people, including the present president, thought that I was afraid of the Ernst & Young report because of the way it was presented. I did an analysis of the Ernst & Young report, and I am not an auditor, but I am aware of audit procedures, and I am aware of certain types of audit. And the Ernst & Young report is very flawed. People only look at what it says. They have not examined it properly. There are a lot of flaws in the Ernst & Young report. A lot of flaws. I'll give you one. I'll give you one, just one, and there are many, I'll just give you one. In doing a report, in doing an audit, one of the things the auditor must have in their possession is the minutes of executive meetings for the period of audit. You agree?
But they were saying they couldn't get that. They weren't allowed to access it.
Well, I will explain. Right? But you agree that that is one of the things required, because
yes, I am agreeing.
You must know what decisions were taken at meetings.
Correct.
Of the board of the, right? Okay.
Correct.
So the period that Ernst & Young reported was from the 1st of July 2012 to the 30th of June 2016. Pan Tobago's financial year as you would realize, is from the 1st of July to the 30th of June. So those are the 4 years that they did. So with those 4 years, it means that according to the Constitution, you must have an executive meeting at least once a month. So that is 48 months. So that is 48 meetings. So that is minutes of 48 meetings. That is not to say we didn't meet other than once a month. We met other than once a month. But let us take the bare minimum, 48. And in the report, I mightn't put my hand on the actual page, but I know it's outstanding. 21 out of 48, 21 out of 48 minutes. 21 minutes of meetings out of 48 is what Ernst & Young had in the possession. If Ernst & Young and the Minister of Culture wanted to get all of them, let me also say this. When I got the information that Ernst & Young was now in Tobago, I had resigned by then. But I called the then Minister of Culture and I said to her, Madam Minister, I know you don't know who you're dealing with, but I know. And I know that Diaz would try not to give you all the information which is required. So I would suggest that the auditors take a particular position. And I suggested to her a process whereby she would have been able to, not she, but the auditors would have been able to get all the information that was required to do a complete audit. They never did it. I'll give you another example. The person who blew the whistle was myself. If Ernst & Young is doing a proper audit, it stands to reason that they would interview all members of the executive during the period. I, as the events manager and the person who, let me say, blow the whistle, I was never interviewed. I was never interviewed. So who was interviewed? So where did they get the information? I advised the minister to please advise the auditors to take a particular course of action in terms of who they interview, when they interview them, and how they interview them, if they really want to get to the bottom of everything. They never did it. So the Ernst & Young report is severely flawed. And let me say this. The auditing community would not, they don't criticize one another, at least not publicly. So I had my questions about many things in the audit, and I carried it to a friend of mine who is an auditor, and he indicated, Brian, you are very correct, but we cannot make any comment on it. So this is a young report that everybody is happy about. It's severely flawed.
All right, but Mr. Serret, Ernst & Young did report for about 3 years, not so? It's about 3 years?
4 years. 4 years.
4 years. Make it 4 years. So
not make it 4 years. 4 years.
4 years. So what was happening in terms of the accountability of BAGO in those 4 years that did not allow the information that you are saying the auditors could not retrieve to be presented to the executive of BAGO, which would have negated Ernst & Young having to do an audit? Yes, sorry.
I think you're misunderstanding something. Let's understand.
Yes, go ahead.
Let's understand.
Go ahead.
This audit was commissioned in 2017. The period of audit is 2012 to 2016. That's the first thing. Right? So Ernst & Young couldn't. What you think, talking about they couldn't do that. Also,
no, I'm saying also, at the level of BAGO, 4 years passed without any...
that is not, it is not so. If you read the report, you will recognize that Tobago had an auditor. Tobago was audited every year, and audited statements went to the Ministry of Culture every year, People somehow that is lost. Tobago was audited every year from 2000. From the year 2000, Tobago was audited every year, including those years. Okay? And the audit would have indicated certain things. And that is one of the reasons why I resigned. because the letter from the auditor would require certain things. And instead of those letters being dealt with at the executive level, there was a fight between, well, not so much many of the executives, but myself and the president, as to let us go through the letter and deal with the issues that the auditors raised. And he never tried to deal with them. And at the end of the day, I get fed up and I say, I'm not staying here. I cannot stay here. So it is not that everything was people and the present president and people pick it up in the same way, act as though Punch and BAGO were never audited and it was just craziness going on. That is not the case.
Okay.
That is not the case. There are particular instances that things were not properly done. Particular instances. It is not the whole thing was in a mess and shambles and anything. That's not what was taking place. So get that out of the picture. That is not the case. Okay, that is not the case.
All right, okay, understood. But in terms of, moving on a little bit, in terms of value for money, along those years, I think I picked up maybe subventions to the tune of $30 million and counting.
And you would have heard, you would have heard the present president say something, I think it was Saturday night or somewhere, that Punch and BAGO do get subvention. We have been saying that for years, and she herself alluded to subvention when she was just out and just coming. Now she's singing the same song. Punch and BAGO do get some. Punch and BAGO do get subvention. Let me tell you what Punch and BAGO gets. Punch and BAGO gets money to run Panorama to pay prizes, and that's what they get. That's what they get.
Okay.
That is all they get. Punch and BAGO do get subvention to run the business all through the year.
But
Punch and BAGO do get that.
So
that is all that is part of the misinformation about Panorama and Punch and BAGO.
But I'm glad you raised that. So the question now is then, there's so much development that could take place in this steel pan industry. Does it make sense to invest $30 million and counting annually into a Panorama when I don't even think we export $5 million in pan annually, and I could be wrong because I don't know the figures, I don't see the figures, but I am doubting that we export that quantity of pans commensurate with the monies that go towards Panorama. The question I'm begging here is the whole issue of value for money. I mean, as a taxpayer, are we getting value for the money we spend on Punch and BAGO? And I'm thinking we can get more value for the same money that we are spending.
No,
go ahead.
No, not you don't. You don't spend. The government doesn't spend money on Punch and BAGO. Right? They don't spend money on Punch and BAGO. They spend money on the steel bands. And yes, you get value for money because for 1 minute, now you could get more value. You know, there's more value could be had if the government and if steel band people and if many other people put their heads together, look at some of the reports that have been done as to what should be happening with steel band, we will get more.
Right, so if there are three things, things we could point to that might or could be done so that you'll get more value for money, what would those things be, Mr. Serrett?
Okay. No, that is not, how should I put it? That is trying to put something huge in a little box. Okay, but I will try to satisfy your question.
Okay.
But your question is not really adequate, but I will try to satisfy.
Okay.
Okay? From where I sit, my view of Panorama, which is why I instituted a lot of changes in the Panorama, because I have a particular view of Panorama. I've had it for umpteen years, and I'll tell you what it is. The first thing is the money that is to be paid to the steel bandmen for Panorama does not reside in Trinidad. This is a statement I made since 1991-92. the money to be paid to steel bandsmen for their performances in Panorama does not reside in Trinidad. You know what I mean by that?
Okay.
I mean that what we should have been doing, and that is what I was trying to do while I was there, is redesign the Panorama product to make it attractive to a world market. And it can be done. While I was there, I had interest from people outside of Trinidad to do certain things, but certain people didn't want things to happen. So the first thing is the monies reside out of Trinidad, and we have to redesign and realign what we do to attract the money from outside. You see, all this that talk about BP and TTT and how much seed they buy and how much million, I'm going to tell you something. That is nothing. I heard the president say that the sponsors accounted for $4 million. Okay. In 2014, I did a project aligned for Pension BAGO aligned to the Panorama called the Greens. I am the person who invented the Greens. And you know what was the ticket revenue of 2014? $4.9 million. The ticket sales revenue for 2014 was $4.9 million. Okay, that's just an aside. So I'm saying to you, again, the first thing is the money to pay steel bands and steel pan players for their Panorama effort does not reside in Trinidad. And it is the responsibility of Pension BAGO, of the Ministry of Culture, instead of grinning and skinning all over the place, the Minister of Culture, the government and the whole, to enable the environment for the steel band movement to achieve that. Okay. Instead of the nonsense and the foolishness that they do.
Yeah, but Mr. Serrett, so that's just one, but we kind of wrap in, so I must ask, maybe we could return to it, we have a little time, but the elephant in the question, in the room question. Listen, Cats and Jammers, winning, I think it's 3 years on a straight. Now for me, I recall Winston Gypsy Peters entering the, what's that competition called? Extempo, while being the chairman of the NCC. And to me, that was a clear conflict of interest. The way I understand conflict of interest, a chairman of the NCC ought not to enter a competition that is being held under the auspices or being paid for by the same entity. Yes? I think that's a clear conflict of interest. And I felt so at the time.
Okay.
But there's a construct in the Pension BAGO arrangement that allows the bands that are managed by its executive members to participate in competitions and win money. I find that offensive. It matters not to me. It matters not to me if it is Miss Beverly Ramsey Moore, if it is Keith Diaz, if it was Patrick Arnold deceased. The construct of it is bad, it's poor. And I'm saying, you have expressed that you have been there. How do you view that kind of construct where executive members who continue to hold executive positions in the organization have their bands entering and winning these competitions?
Okay, I'll answer you this way. In the first instance, Pension BAGO is made up, the persons who comprise the executive of Pension BAGO are all members of steel bands. So it begs the question, how come that question has never been asked before? You know why it has never been asked before? Because there was never any apparent conflict of interest that occurred before. For example, let me use a Tobago. Patrick Arnold was the president of Pension BAGO. Everybody know our boys is Patrick Arnold. Did anybody ever question any placing of our boys in any panorama? They never did. You know why? I'll tell you why. Ever since Arnim Smith and up until Kidiaz, and I'm saying up until Kidiaz because I'm seeing that it's different now, which is why the questions are being asked. A team was put together who would work with the judges in terms of receiving the score sheets, analyzing them, counting them, doing all what they need to do. No member of the central executive or any executive was allowed to be anywhere near that situation, that
So are you
process,
saying
that
that has
procedure.
changed now? That has changed now?
It has obviously changed. Everybody sees it. There was a video last year that circulated where the president and the treasurer had the score sheets in their hand before the score sheet, they were announced. Everyone sees what is taking place. That is why there's the question. Let me tell you something. Arnim Smith, the big bad Arnim Smith that people like to wash them out on because they really don't know who and what he was in Steel Band. They know outside how they might view him. They don't know him in Steel Band. Arnim Smith was from Blue Diamonds. Some people say from Tokyo. He's not from Tokyo. Arnim Smith band was Blue Diamonds. And then he formed a band in 1980 called Jewel 22. Jewel 22 was his band. Jewel 22 went to two panoramas, 1980 and 1981. In 1980, they came fourth doing an arrangement by Len Booksy Sharp, Wanted Dead or Alive. You think there was any question about how come Jewel win the panorama or winning the panorama? The next year, Jewel probably they make the semi-final and they ain't go no further. Arnim Smith was the president. There was no question. Owen Surratt was the president of BAGO for after Arnim. Owen Surratt was a solo Hammonite. Owen Surratt, he and solo Hammonites followed, he had solo Pan nights. Was there ever any question about solo Hammonites winning panorama and this and that and the other? There was never a question. There was never a question. The question after Owen was Patrick Arnold, after Patrick Arnold, Kidiaz was aligned to Desperados. Did you ever hear any question about Desperados winning panorama and this and any question about the cheat for Desperados? You would never hear that because it was never the case.
I think you have made the point sufficiently, and the truth is we have run out of time. But certainly, I will want to have you back to discuss this issue of steel pan and exporting steel pan from Tobago, because my knowledge suggests to me that there was a gentleman located in Cove in Tobago, I think it was Panjumbi, who was doing or attempting to do some manufacturing and export of steel pan, and it didn't work itself out. And I think exporting steel pan, re-importing them for tuning and exporting again, I think is a excellent industry for Tobago to venture into this orange economy. And yes, sorry, go ahead. Well, we're wrapping now.
Well, I
final comments.
I met with some people in New York in 2016, 2015 into 2016, who indicated that there was an interest with doing some work in the Cove with production of pans.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm hopeful we can probably discuss maybe reaching out to them, because there's still room there's a lot of room in Cove, and I think, it will be a useful addition to have pans being exported from Cove. Mr. Surratt, I want to thank you for, taking the interrogation and explaining to us, Pantry in BAGO and how it operates and so on, and giving our listeners a better insight into Pantry in BAGO and how it operates and how we might want to address, this industry called steel pan that could do so much for Trinidad and Tobago as well. Thanks again, Mr. Surratt, and it was a pleasure having you.
Yeah, my pleasure. We haven't dealt with the future, some of the things I think we should be putting in place, but we will deal with that another time.
Appreciated. Thanks again, Mr. Surratt. Well, viewers, we have come to the end of another session of Plain Talk. I trust that, we have all been able to understand a bit more about the steel pan industry and what we can do, because I think it's an industry of the future for Tobago, and we ought to begin looking at the industry very seriously to see what we can do with this national instrument that has not lived up to its potential in terms of earning foreign exchange for this country and even for Tobago. Thank you once again for listening, and we come back at you next week with more plain talk, dissecting the issues as they happen in the Tobago space and as they affect us here in Tobago. Thank you.
He's done so much for me, I cannot tell it all.
The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the commentators, guest, and the host. They do not explicitly or necessarily reflect nor represent the policy or views held by Tobago Updates or this network. Tobago Updates or this network cannot be held accountable for all or any views expressed during this program.
The following was a paid political broadcast.